The issue that I wanted to address today is the issue of sexual abuse in the church. And I don't really know how much I can add to this, as has been really done so much, especially in recent times, since kind of the metoo movement started. And then the whole hashtag of churchtoo began, and people started talking about these issues recently about sexual abuse in the church and how, it hasn't really been handled all that well. And a lot of people have spoken about this, but I just wanted to give my insights for whatever they're worth. And essentially, I think three important pieces of information that those of us in the church, those of us in leadership positions in the church, pastors and others, things that we need to be aware of and be thinking about as we're addressing these issues of sexual abuse. Because it is a real issue. And it is true that there have been churches that have really handled these things very poorly in the past. And you look at C.J. Mahaney and the Sovereign Grace events that happened with sexual abuse. If you're not familiar with that, you can do a quick Google search and find the information and, do the research yourself and I guess come to whatever conclusion you want. But I think it was pretty clear that there were some things put in place where the protection was on really those who were guilty of sexual abuse rather than those who were those who were abused. All right. So I think it pretty clearly is a problem, and it's been a problem. And it's not a problem just uniquely in the church. I mean, it's a problem in general in any kind of organization. So, but the problem is that, the church should be a safe haven for victims, and it hasn't always been that. And the problems that have affected any secular institutions, the stuff we're seeing in Hollywood now and other places, the church has not always been free of those things, which we might assume that it had been. And with the information that's come out recently, and really not just that recently, there's been a ton of this kind of stuff coming out for years. It just happens to be the national conversation at the moment. But there are some problems that really, really need to be addressed. And so here are a few kind of pieces of advice or concerns that we can bring up when talking about these issues. The first is that we need to make sure that proper measures are put in place where any possibilities of abuse can be negated, so that there are extra precautions taken. And churches don't always take those extra precautions. I knew a congregation where there was a pastor who had been abusing children during Sunday school, and it was a long time that this was happening, and nobody found out. There were no windows in the room, the door was closed, there was no one checking in on this person. And I think the most important thing we can do first and foremost is just in our churches, just equip people and have measures in place, have things in place that protect against this. And that doesn't mean that these things will never happen. Unfortunately, that's part of sin, is that we can't have perfect measures that take care of this, but we can minimize these circumstances as much as possible. And we can do that by being careful as to, how we structure things, how careful we are about issues going on in the church. For example, a male pastor should not be alone with a female congregant in the office with the door closed with no one else in the building. Right, so maybe just make sure someone else is in the building at the times when those things happen, for, if it's private confession and absolution or other things, or if there's counseling, perhaps involve a woman in counseling as well. And it's good to have women that are equipped to deal with those issues in your congregation also. Other things are, equipping people to have knowledge of things like measures of child safety and things to guard against abuse of children in, Sunday school or wherever. It doesn't mean that somebody in your church is definitely going to do that, but you want to be more careful, as careful as you possibly can be. It's better to be too cautious than not cautious at all. So, set standards. Like I know some churches that have taken old doors that had no windows on them and made sure to put windows on every single door that is in a Sunday school room so people can look in, or make sure that if you have larger Sunday school classes especially, make sure there are 2 adults in there at all times, or never teach without the door open, or have somebody walking back and forth in the hallways and watching everything every Sunday. And these things might sound like extreme measures, but this stuff happens a lot. It's a lot more common than we really like to admit. So that's kind of the first piece of advice I would give is try to fix the problem before it starts. So be overly cautious. Instead of just waiting till these kinds of things happen and you have to deal with it, try to get ahead of it. And the second piece of advice that I have is make sure that if you're somebody who's a leader in the church, or if you have kids, talk to them about these issues early. Talk to them about sexual abuse. Tell them that these things are not supposed to happen to you. If these things ever do happen, go and speak to the people you need to speak to. And, I've done that, for example, with confirmation students, and I think some of them had never really heard that before. They hadn't really thought about those things, and hopefully they never encounter it in a church. But talk about it. Let them know that these things are not normal. The church leadership, the pastor, whoever, these are people that you need to contact if anything like this ever happens, if there's any kind of abuse, and explain to them what that abuse is. This is something that every parent should be talking to their children about. And as pastors, it's something that we can talk about and talk to parents about, so that they know that their children know these things, and so that they're not scared. If those things were to happen, that they would know who to go to. They would know that it's not normal, that it's a problem, and they would go to the proper authorities to deal with it. And the third point, which is the one that's really, really important, which is where so many churches have really failed here, is that we have to recognize that it is not the church's function to take the role of the civil authorities in dealing with these issues. Okay, the church has a specific called role. God has instituted different estates in this world. Martin Luther said there were basically three estates. We've got the church, the family, and then the government. And then we've got vocation, which Luther saw as kind of an outgrowth of the family. We could talk about that maybe as a fourth estate as well, depending on how you want to categorize things. But the point is this, that God has instituted different things to govern the world for different functions. And none of those one things can try to take the function of the others. So that means that the states cannot take over the role of the church, cannot say what you're supposed to believe, how you worship, those kind of things. That's the function of the church. But at the same time, the church cannot take over the functions of the state, because God created the state. It has a positive role. Sure, it doesn't always fulfill that positive role and doesn't always function as it should properly. But the state is given an appointed role, and part of that appointed role is that the state's function is to prosecute those who are guilty. And there's a confusion when churches try to handle issues of sexual abuse internally and don't go to the state for whatever reason. They think, well, we can just handle it, or because we've dealt with the issue and we've absolved and given forgiveness to the person who perpetrated this thing, therefore, you're good to go. And don't talk to the authorities, because it might make the church look bad if they find out that there's been some kind of sexual abuse here. That too often is what happens. And God has properly instituted both the church and the state, and it's not the church's function to mete out proper punishment for actions that should be dealt with by the law. It is the church's proper function to do things like proclaim repentance, the forgiveness of sins, talk about issues of sin, and those things need to be dealt with by the church. But being forgiven by God does not get you off the hook for civil punishments. Because you've been forgiven by God, that does not mean now that you don't have to go to the civil authorities. If someone came into my office today and said, Pastor, I want forgiveness. And I say, okay, what do you want forgiveness for? And they say, I just went on a killing spree. I just, shot 20 people, and I really want to be forgiven. All right, what do I do? Should I just say, all right, you're forgiven. Go do whatever you want? I mean, of course not. We all understand that in that circumstance, what would I say? I'd say, all right, have you gone to the authorities and told them what you did? That would be the first question I would ask. And they'd say, no, I just want forgiveness. I don't want to tell anybody. I'd say, I'm not giving you absolution, and I'm calling the cops immediately, and you're going to get arrested and go to jail for a very long time. And that's, that of course is what I would do in that situation. Why is that different with cases of sexual abuse? And somehow people have thought that in those circumstances, we can protect the people that need to be protected. The church can just handle these things internally. We don't need to address those issues. We, maybe give them a little bit of counseling or something else, and don't actually do anything to those who were the abusers. Well, God set up the civil authorities for a function. And the church should, when confronted with illegal acts, immediately contact the necessary state authorities, because those are authorities that have also been given by God for the proper function of punishing evil and dealing with things like jail time, giving civil punishments. That's the purpose. That's the function of the government. And so we need to be equipped to do that. And we need to teach others to do that too. Those who are in leadership positions in the church need to teach other people about the proper function. This is the proper role of the church. This is the proper role of the state. If something spills over from here to here, you got to contact them, and that is the place where you deal with it. I have seen so many circumstances where churches have just tried to do these things internally. And sometimes, the craziest thing is when churches do things like, well, you've got a married man, and this has happened many times, especially more in independent fundamentalist Baptist churches, which is a whole other issue. There's so many problems that we could talk about there as well. But in some of those congregations, there have been many instances where what happens is a man in the church sleeps with an underage girl in the congregation. And when that happens, it is the underage girl in the congregation that is said to be guilty because she dressed too immodestly or something like that. And the guy gets off the hook. And maybe he repents or whatever in front of the congregation, and they forgive him and they move on. And the girl, the victim, is the one who is declared guilty. Now, we could talk about modesty. That's a whole other discussion. And I think modesty is obviously a good thing. And the New Testament talks about modesty. But no matter how immodest someone dresses, even if they're dressing in a way that probably is not the best way to dress, it is never that individual's fault when somebody abuses them. You can never dress so immodestly that it is your fault that somebody sexually abuses you. Never. Okay? And again, we should, encourage women to dress modestly. We should encourage men to dress modestly too. I see people encouraging women to dress modestly, and the men are okay wearing, these tight muscle shirts showing off their bodies or whatever. So you got to be consistent. But we should talk about modesty. Sure, that's an important thing. But never blame the victim, even if maybe they didn't make the wisest decision. It's not their fault. If somebody goes in an area of town that's bad and walks down the street and gets shot, are they at fault? Or is the person who shot them at fault? Okay, maybe they didn't make the wisest decision going to that area of town, but it's not their fault. Of course not. They're a victim. Yeah, maybe they went somewhere that wasn't the smartest place to go, but the person who shot them is the one that needs to get arrested because it's their fault. You can't go to court and make the excuse, well, it's a bad area of town. He knew that when he came here, so I could shoot him, And it's the same kind of thing that we're doing when the church tries to blame the victim for what the victimizer has done. There's no excuse for this stuff. So these are just a few pieces of advice. And like I said, everyone else has really been dealing with this issue. I don't know what my insights are worth, but since I've dealt with other issues of problems in the church and just kind of how to handle some issues in the church, people had asked me to deal with this particular subject. So hopefully, for what it's worth, this advice will be helpful. It's something that we all need to be thinking about. We all need to be talking about. Everyone in the church needs to be thinking about this issue, especially if you are in a leadership position in the church in one way or another. And let's do everything we possibly can to make the church the safe place that it should be for those who are victims of sexual assault. So thanks so much for watching. And if you like this video, check out our other videos and subscribe, like, comment, all of those good things. If you have any other ideas you want me to address certain things in future videos, let me know. Thanks so much, and God bless.